Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the fourth part of our community pharmacy, Edward Kremers seminar in the history of pharmacy and drugs. My name is Lucas Rickert. I'm the director of the AIHP and also faculty member in the School of Pharmacy. So these two groups are co-sponsoring this event, and the Erdang Lab, which I sponsor, is also contributing. A few housekeeping notes for you. Please, if you want to ask a question during the Q&A session at the end, you can use the chat feature, or you can do that raise your hand button, and then Hannah will call on you. Please, if you can, keep your audio muted during the presentation until you are asking a question at the end. If you're interested in closed captioning, click on the live transcript button. And then also, if you are one of these people that's using social media, we would encourage you to use hashtag Kremers if you're posting. Then it's also important to note that this event is being recorded and it may be posted to the web, maybe posted on social media. And this is for people who aren't able to attend today and wanted to watch later on down the road on our YouTube channel. And I just flag up for you that there's a lot of excellent content on the AIHP YouTube channel. And please check that out in the future. That being said, all participants should be aware that their voice, their video image questions as entered in Zoom may appear in on the web and in the recording. So that's it for the housekeeping. And thank you for bearing with me in doing that housekeeping. It's a privilege now and a pleasure to introduce Hannah Swan. Hannah is an archivist at the School of Pharmacy here at UW-Madison. And she works closely with staff in the American Institute for the History of Pharmacy. She's currently working on a National Endowment of the Humanities grant-funded project, which is aimed at processing, digitizing, and then exhibiting the collections of the Edward Kremers Research Library and Archive. Hannah, who is an excellent colleague, holds a postgraduate diploma in archives and records management from University College London, and also a master's in book history and material culture from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. She's worked in special collections and in this field for over 6 years now, and it's worth noting that she's received individual international recognition for her own collecting, particularly her collection of mid-century American party planning books and ephemera. I'm really looking forward to this presentation. I hope you are as well. The title is Preserving Community Pharmacy History, Institutional and Personal Approaches. And Hannah, I'll turn it over to you. And thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, Luke. Can everyone see the presentation? Okay, great. So first off, I do want to apologize. I am a bit sick, so any kind of voice, coughing, etc., I apologize in advance. So as Luke said, this is Preserving Community Pharmacy History, Institutional and Personal Approaches. I want to thank you all so much for attending this talk and for your interest in the history of community pharmacy. Today, I'll first be speaking a bit on the collections we hold here in the archive, looking at the resources that are available to researchers in the history of community pharmacy. That'll be illustrated with lots of fun images from our collections. And I'll then spend a moment reflecting on why the history of community pharmacy isn't just about community pharmacy. So, in other words, how these histories can shed light on our understandings of broader social, cultural, and economic contexts. In part two, I will move into a more practical section on how to preserve your own collections, including everything from storage to DIY cataloging to finding a permanent home for your materials. This in turn reflects back upon the work I'm undertaking here at UW-Madison. So I'll be interspersing my, hot tips and tricks with an insight into how I am working to modernize our collections. So before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I present to you today from Dejob, the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk Nation, who have stewarded and continue to steward this land and its natural resources, in spite of attempts at erasure by settlers. When we think about pharmacy collections in particular, it's important to consider the indigenous medicines and healing practices that laid the groundwork for many of the pharmaceuticals we take for granted today. Many of the compounds we use were originally taken from botanicals, and many of these, in turn, were known to pharmaceutical companies only through indigenous practices. They were then grown on stolen land, all part of a cycle of exploitation and colonization. As an archivist, I work actively to center these indigenous knowledge systems through reparative naming and collecting. So to begin, I'm going to first do a quick introduction to the archive and library from which this talk will be drawn before zooming in specifically on our community pharmacy collections. So the Edward Kremers Research Library and Archive, or EKRLA, is the joint repository held by the UW-Madison School of Pharmacy and the American Institute of the History of Pharmacy. It was founded in the 1890s by this man you see in the middle here, the eponymous Edward Kremers. And the collection was originally intended to inform the writing of Kremers' History of Pharmacy textbook, which was jointly completed with George Erdong, founder of AIHP. The collection has substantially grown beyond this original project and now comprises just over 700 file drawers of materials tracing the history of pharmacy. It is largely a print-based collection, things like advertisements, circulars, scientific article reprints, and other printed ephemera, but there are also significant holdings of manuscript materials, such as correspondence, business records, and unpublished works on pharmacy and pharmacy history. There's also a vast collection of pharmaceutical artifacts, things like bottles, packaging, pharmaceutical implements, or our beloved mortar and pestle lamp you see here on the left, which would have originally hung outside a pharmacy. So moving right along into our main event, so community pharmacy history in the EKRLA. So right away, I think you'll be able to tell that there's a real diversity of material types when it comes to our ComPharm collections. Just on this slide, we have a journal, an event program, a postcard, a paper prescription bag, and even a comic strip. This diversity points to the non-traditional ways of doing community pharmacy history that the collection facilitates. Traditionally, we think of journal articles, business correspondence, pharmacy records, maybe prescriptions to help us understand these histories. And the EKRLA certainly holds a wealth of those materials. But we can also use a wide range of printed ephemera to give us insight into daily life in the pharmacy. As an aside, for those of you unfamiliar, ephemera are, to take the late great Maurice Ricard's phrase, the minor transitory documents of everyday life. So that means that these are usually printed paper items that you use for a specific time period and then discard, such as tickets, brochures, or even a printed cocktail napkin. We can take a closer look at two of these items to illustrate my point. So this postcard from the early 20th century speaks to the advent of the telephone in pharmacy ordering. As you can read here, this postcard was mailed out to reassure skeptical patrons that their orders would still in fact be delivered even if they put in their orders via phone. This can tell us a lot about customer interactions and how phone ordering was received. Similarly, this cartoon from, pardon me, The July 29th, 1905 issue of The Chemist and Druggist can be used as evidence of what would have been common enough scenarios in compounding to prove funny to the average pharmacist. As I am not a pharmacy historian by trade, some of these are kind of lost on me, but certainly we can all understand not putting your goldfish in with the leeches. Oops. There we go. Lastly, I want to draw your attention to some resources that can be used from the comfort of your own home, as I know that not all of you are necessarily able to travel to Madison to conduct research. So last year, I gave a presentation to the Society for Textual Scholarship that looked at the intersections of printing and design histories and druggist labels. Druggist labels give us a lot of insight into how pharmacies marketed themselves, as well as giving us invaluable information about the locations of pharmacy over time. I'm fairly confident that the EKRLA has what is probably the foremost collection of druggist labels and associated ephemera in the country, if not the world. My talk focused on the labels themselves, how the history of the pharmacy label can be used as a lens through which to understand the evolution of commercial printing technologies. The video is now available on the AIHP YouTube page, with which Luke conveniently just shouted out. So if you're interested in checking it out, you can follow the QR code here on the upper right. And finally, you may not know that Drug Topics magazine, still one of the leading pharmacy publications in the country, actually donated its photo morgue to AIHP in the 1970s. The collection contains thousands of images that give a unique insight into community pharmacy life across America from the 1940s to the 1970s. The collection is arranged topically and covers everything from store windows to soda fountains to my favorite, pharmacy beauty queens. We've been working to digitize that collection in conjunction with the University of Wisconsin Digital Collection Center. You can follow the QR code in the bottom left here to check out that growing digital collection. We've also been working with UWDCC to digitize our collection of pharmaceutical trade catalogs. These are perhaps slightly less relevant to community pharmacy, but they do show what products were available for pharmacists to order. Excuse me. I'm now going to move through a non-exhaustive list of some of the areas of ComPharm history represented in the EKRLA collections. So first up, we have pharmacist associations. Perhaps most notably, we hold many records, correspondence, and articles from NARD, N-A-R-D, the National Association of Retail Druggists, now known as the National Community Pharmacists Association, which today represents almost 20,000 independent community pharmacies nationwide. We also hold a variety of records from state pharmacist associations, obviously with a real strength in Wisconsin materials. We also hold foreign language materials, including a large collection of materials from the New York German Pharmacists Association, or if you'll pardon my terrible German pronunciation, the New Yorker Deutschen Apothekervereins. Some of my personal favorite records from the various organizations are the programs from the annual meetings, which often include details of the events and contests held. The 20th annual meeting of the Wisconsin Pharmaceutical Association in 1900, for example, included awards for, quote, the lightest and heaviest couples in attendance, the lady with the most ruby lips, and the most popular druggist to be voted on by the ladies. Prizes ranged from a box of cigars to bottles of perfume to half a dozen bottles of wine for medicinal purposes, of course. Beyond just amusement at the outdated pastimes, records of pharmacist organizations can help us understand how pharmacists networked in the 19th and 20th centuries, what issues were being raised both locally and nationally, and how pharmacists understood their profession. So the EKRLA holds a real treasure trove of documentation of pharmacy design and layout, ranging from photos of drugstore interiors from the 19th and 20th centuries, to manuals on optimizing pharmacy layouts, to advertisements and catalogs of pharmacy furniture. Returning to the question of druggist labels, you'll notice that this image of Malat's, a much beloved and now defunct drugstore here in Madison, is actually from a soda label. It dates to the 1920s when Prohibition drove up soda fountain sales and many pharmacies marketed in-house sodas. This label shows us how non-traditional material types can inform historical research. The storefront shows us how the store marketed itself. For example, the prominence of the soda fountain and the lunch counter, and relative sidelining of the pharmaceutical side of the business, as well as the designs of windows and signage. Records of pharmacy interiors can show us how products were grouped, what was given prominence, and how displays were designed, all giving insight into contemporary socio-cultural and economic values. So I know we're really cruising through here, but this is just meant to give you all a sense of what materials are in the collection rather than being a particularly deep dive. So in addition to the information about products given by pharmacy interiors, the EKRLA also has a robust collection of professional literature about running a community pharmacy. There are published statistics on consumer behavior, suggestions on purchasing, as you see here on the left, as well as journal articles, organizational records, and business correspondence speaking to pharmacists' attitudes towards working in sales. We also have an incredible collection on pharmaceutical detailing that was donated by Arthur Peterson, who spent his career, most of his career working in detailing, or as a detail man, as he refers to himself. For those of you unfamiliar, detailing is the marketing practice of direct contact between a pharmaceutical rep and a doctor. And again, there's also our amazing collection of trade catalogs, which show off the products available to pharmacies for purchase. They can tell us not only what drugs and products are available when, but also at what wholesale price. And of course, as we've heard from our other great speakers over the last few days, a pharmacy wouldn't be a pharmacy without a pharmacist and associated staff. So this is one of my favorite parts of the collection, as it really showcases the psychology of the business of pharmacy at any given point. You know, what the standards were, for example, for employee dress, or who is expected to fulfill what task. We have employee manuals, etiquette booklets, job applications and position descriptions, pay structures, and photos of pharmacy employees. We also have a large collection about women pharmacists dating back to the 19th century, asking the hard-hitting questions like, should women be allowed to be pharmacists? And of course, also giving us really interesting insights into the history of women at work. So this is something that Luke spoke to on Tuesday, and I think which both Taylor and Liz's talks touched on as well. Given the recent AMA statement, I went looking for historical context on pharmacist-physician relationships and found that we actually have a really deep collection of these materials. Unfortunately, the big takeaway was that some things never change. My favorite of these materials is the collection of these physician-pharmacist relationship questionnaires that were sent out to physicians in the 1960s by our friend and detail man, Arthur Peterson. I know it's a bit hard to read, but question 3 here on the right reads, instead of writing a prescription for a drug product as heretofore, the physician should write the diagnosis on the prescription blank and, therewith, let the pharmacist determine what drug and manufacturer's drug product and what dosage should be used by the patient. What is your opinion? And this doctor just writes, crazy as hell. And it's interesting because I think to many of the pharmacists in the audience, that proposition might make a lot of sense. But crazy as hell is, in not quite so strong nor succinct language, essentially what the recent AMA statement boiled down to. Now, finally, before we move into some case studies, I just want to highlight that we are continuing to collect materials related to the history of community pharmacy. These are 3 new acquisitions that have been purchased for the collection in recent months. On the left, we have the Rexall Advantages magazine, published by the United Drug Company in 1930, which shows off the many ways to display and promote Rexall products in retail pharmacies. As the magazine was published right after the stock market crash of October 1929, it serves as a window, drugstore pun intended, into pharmacies at the onset of the Great Depression. This issue of Rexall Advantages is held by only one other library in the United States, according to WorldCat, meaning that this fills not only a gap in our collections, but also in American pharmacy history collections more broadly. In the middle is an advertisement published by John E. Taylor, a druggist working in Philadelphia in the 1830s. It's a circular, meaning it was sent out to customers, which we know from the manuscript address on the back of this broadside. The majority of the EKRLA collections date to the second half of the 19th century and forward, so this circular helps us trace the lineage of community pharmacy further back, connecting the medicines and products advertised by Taylor to their development over time. For example, his advertisement of mineral, seltzer, Saratoga, and Ballstown waters connects to the long history of soda water and the pharmacy, from these early medicinal mineral waters through to the flourishing of the soda fountain during Prohibition. Finally, here on the right, we have a really exciting new edition that I purchased earlier this year. So this is a letter from Olivia D. Tucker, Secretary of the North Harlem Pharmaceutical Association, which was a Black Pharmacists Association. This letter was sent to members on April 8th, 1939. The letter announces their upcoming meeting and contains all kinds of interesting insights, from the reference to pharmacist jobs being, quote, menaced, to the distrust of other national pharmaceutical organizations. And because the collections of the EKRLA were mostly compiled by old white dudes, I have been undertaking what we would call reparative collecting, involving the identification of historical gaps in the collection, voices that are being left out of the narrative that the archive tells, and then putting our resources towards addressing those lacunae. So we've just spent a good amount of time breezing through the kinds of materials you can find in our collection. And just know that that was by no means an exhaustive overview, neither in material type nor in collection scope. So now I want to take a moment to delve into some case studies to show how ComPharm history doesn't just reflect back on pharmacy, but how it can really be used as a prism through which we can understand broader sociocultural moments. So first, I want to draw your attention to our materials that relate to women and the drugstore and ask, how can we use these materials to understand broader conceptualizations of women as consumers in the 20th century? As I mentioned, we have some great materials on the history of women in the pharmacy profession, but we also have a large number of items that relate to women as consumers. Though in the early to mid 20th century, men were still by and large the breadwinners of families, it was often women who did the shopping. So much ink was spilled over figuring out how to attract and keep female customers. These materials can be used to recreate the underlying ideas around what women want, such as in the Beauty for Sale booklet from Rexall about selling cosmetics. But it can also give a comparative database look at what women actually did buy at the pharmacy. So the green book, second from the left here, is one of my favorite items, which I digitized as part of my NEH grant work. It's a booklet published by the Homemakers Guild of America and contains the results of a survey of homemakers across the United States. The survey was wide-ranging, including everything from questions about what color bottle they would prefer liquid prescriptions be filled in, 66.1% said clear, to where they get their prescriptions filled, 73.3% said at an independently operated drugstore, compared to 9.7% at a large corporate chain drugstore. Those were the days, right? To how pharmacies could make them more comfortable when shopping for feminine hygiene products. 62.3% said women clerks, while 23.3% said they found their current arrangement satisfactory. Obviously, there's a wealth of information here about women's interactions with the drugstore, but there also emerges a broader picture of women's consumption patterns in the post-war period. The booklet includes a visualization of what percentage of women in the guild own different appliances. There are statistics on how often women had goods other than pharmaceuticals delivered to their homes. And there's a final comment section that speaks to cultural norms around shops, with many of the women commenting on the importance of neatness, cleanliness, and open space. We can tie these ideas to the post-war rise of suburbia, changes in consumer habits, and new cultures of efficiency at mid-century. I would also be remiss if I didn't point out a favorite window of mine from the Drug Topics collection, the Skillerns Wife Saving Station over here on the right. We can again connect this to the emphasis on efficiency in housekeeping and the mechanization of many household tasks, but mostly it just makes me laugh. Though community pharmacy is the through line in these materials, we can clearly see how they might be of use to a historian of gender and economics who might be otherwise uninterested in community pharmacy history. Finally, it wouldn't be a presentation for me if I didn't bring things around to my area of study. So I'm not a pharmacy historian, though I've certainly grown to love pharmacy history over my tenure here. I'm actually a material textual scholar by trade. So my area of focus is book history, the book, and other printed objects as material artifacts. I've already mentioned the presentation I gave on druggist labels, which is a perfect example of the intersections of printing histories and the community pharmacy. But how else can we learn about the history of books through Com-Pharm? So again, I could really go on and on here. I'm going to limit myself to a few choice items. So on the left, we see this great photo of a paperback display. This photo was taken at Pennywise Drugs in Caldwell, Idaho in January 1958. So first off, we have a precise date and can see which books were displayed at this drugstore. This can give us a sense of how people bought books, what they were presented with when browsing, and who the audience was for this display. I know you can't really see here all that clearly, but these are largely pulp paperbacks. Mysteries with sordid names like Murder of a Mistress or Case of the Cold Coquette, Westerns, adventure books, and romances. I love pulp, so I really mean no offense to the author of Case of the Cold Coquette when I say that these are not like canonical classic novels, especially by 1958 standards. So this can tell us something about where pulp paperbacks were sold, about what kinds of books were sold at this drugstore, and by comparing it to other photos of book displays, we can compare and contrast across time and geography. There's also a long history of the drugstore and censorship. So we have three examples here of morality and the drugstore print display. In the middle, we have this issue of American Druggist from February 1949, which includes an article entitled "What You Can Do About Bad Comic Books." We also see on the upper right, this pharmacist pointing to his sign that he doesn't sell magazines to minors, taken in 1963. And on the bottom right, we have pharmacist James F. O'Brien and Mrs. Frank Vickery and Miss Mary McQuaid, members of the Manchester Deanery of the National Council of Catholic Women, photographed in 1953 in front of O'Brien's sign indicating that he does not sell, per the caption, quote unquote, indecent literature. Again, a lot to unpack here and very little time, so we can just see how the drugstore, as a popular meeting place in the community, could also be a center for these kinds of debates. I highly doubt that O'Brien was selling The Case of the Cold Coquette, just as in the same moment it was so prominently displayed at Pennywise Drugs. Especially as the author of the Bad Comic Books article specifically lists crime and sex as being the undesirable topics of those eponymous bad comics. This brings up issues of reading and class. It's unlikely that the clientele of Pennywise Drugs in rural Idaho were of the same socioeconomic class as the patrons of the Sullivan Drug Store in Manchester, New Hampshire. Even the names of the stores speak to this divide. So what can we glean about the reading habits of Americans? How is print censorship enacted, not just through legislation at a national level or through post office monitoring, but on the individual level of retailers? Again, a talk for another time, but just a final moment to underline that the materials we hold here at the EKRLA can illuminate histories far beyond the bounds of the community pharmacy. Okay, so now we're going to completely change gears here and pivot towards looking at these collections from a practical collections management perspective. I'll begin with a brief overview of the work we've been taking to modernize the collections of the EKRLA. So I began work here in the fall of 2022 and was hired on, as Luke said, through the National Endowment for the Humanities grant, accessing the history of pharmacy and pharmaceuticals, received by the UW-Madison School of Pharmacy in the same year. The grant is three-pronged. I like to think of it by the acronym PDE: Process, Digitize, Exhibit. The work is split between myself, leading the archival side of the grant, and my colleague Beth Fisher, who's the curator at the American Institute of the History of Pharmacy and who manages the artifact side of the grant. And what I want to underline is that this work is about accessibility. The name of the grant may have been a hint. Right now, the collection is fairly impenetrable to the casual researcher without a lot of guidance from the archival staff. It's also only available on site, which can be prohibitive to a lot of people. We want to make sure that we know what we have, that researchers know what we have, that it's physically accessible, and that it's accessible at least in part online. Over the second part of the presentation, I'll get a bit more granular about what this means in practice. But this is not just about expounding upon the work that we are doing at the EKRLA, because I am not just an ephemerist at work. I'm actually an avid collector in my personal life as well. So this is a photo of most of my collection, as Luke mentioned, of mid-century American party planning books and ephemera, for which I won the 2022 National U.K. Book Collecting Prize from the Antiquarian Booksellers Association. As a personal collector, I understand that much of the institutional approaches to collection management can seem overwhelming to apply to smaller personal collections. So my reflections on the grant work I've been undertaking at the EKRLA will be interwoven with the tips, tricks, and tools that I use for my own collection. And I apologize, I hope you can't hear the planes going overhead here. So I'm hoping there are some pharmacists in the crowd today. As this week's Kremers series focuses on community pharmacy history, I want to remind everyone that the archive we have here wouldn't exist without collaboration and donation from working drugstores as far back as the 19th century. Oftentimes, it can feel as though archives are something maybe too important or too official for your personal papers, business records, or ephemera. But, archives are really meant to be repositories of our collective memory. And if we gatekeep that, we aren't keeping an accurate record of our communities or our sociocultural moment. And though you may have previously thought, why bother preserving the history of my pharmacy? Hopefully this presentation has given you all some insight into the importance of those histories. But of course, the thing is, we can't save everything. In archival practice, we call this appraisal and selection. So to use a non-pharmacy example, when you're at home going through your desk drawers, there are going to be things that you save, maybe family photos, a deed, important records, etc. There's also going to be things that you toss, like a gum wrapper or empty envelopes, things that are no longer of use. And you can think about your pharmacy history in the same way. Obviously, with pharmacies, there's going to be things like patient records and prescriptions that fall under HIPAA. And, that's its own branch of records management. We're not going to get into that right now. But there are also maybe flyers for events that you had at the pharmacy or documentation you created during COVID about vaccinations. Things that are unique to your pharmacy, your cultural context, your town. And those might be the things that you start to consciously collect as a record of the activities of your pharmacy. And I always like to say, good archives start with good records management. So if you are collecting, you do have to think critically, because if you eventually want to donate these materials to a repository, you have to consider that they may not accept the donation if it's full of the records equivalent of empty envelopes and gum wrappers. So in the pharmacy context, this might be things like generic ephemera that kind of proliferate in all pharmacies across the US, things like brochures from corporate insurance providers or drug information packets. It's not to say that it's not valuable in its own way, but it's more important to think critically about what materials reflect the uniqueness of your context. So moving back into the grant, for the first prong, I am working to process 1,000 linear feet of materials in the EKRLA. And that, to give you a sense, is the equivalent of about 500 file drawers of materials. Archival processing for the layperson can be thought of as the physical and intellectual organization of a collection with a goal of making the collection findable and accessible to researchers. In archival terms, the arrangement and description of a collection. In practical terms, this means coming up with a cohesive hierarchical structure for the collection, that's the intellectual organization, arranging the materials within this structure and making sure everything's properly housed, has a unique identifier, etc. That's the physical organization. And finally, creating a finding aid, which is a folder level guide to the contents of the collection. And that is the findability and accessibility piece. All these together give us what's known as intellectual control over the collection. We know how much we have, what we have, and where it all is. So again, my counterpart on the grant is Beth Fisher, curator at AIHP, and she's undertaking an inventory of the physical artifact collection. That process is a little different. So museum inventories focus on back-end findability. So it's more about every item having an identifier, a description, and a location so that staff are able to access the materials for researchers and exhibition. So what does it mean to gain intellectual control over your personal collection? So obviously for most of us, we don't need to create a full series and sub-series structure for our personal collection, though if that floats your boat, absolutely go for it. I find that a simple spreadsheet is the best cataloging tool for the amateur collector. It's free to use. I use Google Sheets. It's fairly intuitive. You can export it into different formats, and it's searchable using the Command or Control F function on your computer. So obviously this is a spreadsheet that I use for my personal collection. The nice thing about using a spreadsheet is that you can endlessly customize your headings. So I focus a lot on advertising ephemera in my collection, for example. So I've chosen to include product advertised in my headings. I also include where I got the item under provenance, and then have a general notes field for printers, lithographers, inscriptions, condition notes, etc. I also have a homegrown classification system that I use based on my collection strengths. As you can see here, one of my other collecting passions is the ephemera of gelatin. Um, and you may notice also that I am, in my personal practice, a bad archivist and cataloger, as none of my records have locations. For me, I find that my storage is often in flux, so I've chosen not to add folder numbers or anything like that, but that can be helpful if you have materials stored in different places. And on the surface, this may not look like the processing work I'm doing on the grant, but the idea is the same. You can intellectually organize, figuring out what you have and how you want to organize it, physically organize, sort and store your collection, which I'll touch on a bit later, and then create access points through something like this spreadsheet. So next is the digitization piece of the grant, again, which I'm splitting with Beth. So we'll be digitizing a total of 1,800 items, about 1,150 pieces of ephemera, and about 650 museum objects. When we digitize, we are creating what are called digital surrogates, which means that we have, hopefully, full digital replicas of the items. The idea being that even if, God forbid, we had some kind of catastrophic event and the item was destroyed, we would still have a working digital item that researchers could access. For both sides of the grant, there is the process of image creation and the process of metadata creation. The image is straightforward. For the archive side of the grant, I use my beloved scanner, seen here on the right, which is actually a new acquisition as of earlier this year, to scan ephemera and manuscript materials from the archive for eventual inclusion in our digital library. If anyone has questions about specs and the like, you can ask in the Q&A period. Next is metadata creation, which is the process of essentially cataloging each digitized item, what it is, who created it, what it's about, etc. This provides searchable access points to researchers when they use our digital library. But before any of the digitizing begins, we also have, again, this process of appraisal and selection, just as I discussed before, but in this context focused on choosing what we will digitize. And this can be a really complex issue as there's a lot of factors at play. There are the practical considerations. So, is the binding of this booklet loose enough that it can lie flat on the scan bed without damaging the item? Is this item out of copyright, or do we own the copyright? But there's also the more nebulous decisions, which can be made based on historical significance, on the amount of use an item gets. So if we have a really popular item, for example, it makes sense to digitize because then we can minimize handling and thus protect it from damage from overuse. We also think about its attractiveness. If we have really eye-catching items, they can be used to promote the digital library and the EKRLA more broadly. Going back to the idea of historical gaps, we might choose to digitize collections that showcase historically underrepresented communities. So there's a lot more considerations than you might think. Back to the kind of grant work, surprisingly to me, one of the hardest parts was choosing a digital asset management system, or DAMS, which is what will host the public-facing digital library. And I won't get into the weeds with this. Again, feel free to ask me in the Q&A, especially if you're at an institution kind of looking for a lower cost DAMS to implement. But I'm just happy to say that we have pretty much landed on Content DM, which is a really great industry standard DAMS, and which we are hoping to implement at some point later this year. Content DM will also hopefully host our final digital exhibit, which is that last prong of the PDE: process, digitize, exhibit. The materials we've been digitizing are very diverse, especially on the artifacts versus ephemera side. I've been doing a lot of older items, while my colleague Beth has focused a lot of her efforts on more modern pharmaceutical swag items. And that makes it kind of hard to curate a specific themed online exhibition. So as such, we've decided that our final digital exhibit will focus more broadly on some of the highlights of our digitization efforts, why the items we've chosen are important to the history of pharmacy, and then how that reflects back upon our own work in appraising, selecting, and digitizing. I'm just going to mute myself briefly. Figured none of you need to hear that. So how can we apply these principles to our own digitization at home? So first off, the question of image creation. I found in my personal digitizing that my home scanner was just not doing it for me as far as color matching and image quality, but mostly I just found it to be excruciatingly slow. And yes, this may be because I've been spoiled by my aforementioned beloved work scanner. So this won't be true for everyone nor for every scanner, but it is something to consider. I personally haven't created digital surrogates for very many items from my collection, maybe 10 out of like nearly 700 pieces of ephemera. I digitize parts of items for use on social media, for publications, or for parts of the collection that have kind of identical bibliographic information, but different cover designs. So what about metadata creation? Again, most of us are not going to be shelling out for a professional DAMS. So how can we associate metadata with our digital images? This is where spreadsheets come back into play. As it says here, spreadsheets are your friends. So when you're creating images of your collection items, you should be sure that they all get unique file names. I'm a fan of descriptive file naming, especially now that computers are so good at searching for files. Descriptive naming just means that the file name is what the thing is. So if I have a booklet called Let's Go Party, the file names of the associated images might be Let's Go Party 1, Let's Go Party 2, or Let's Go Party 1.1, etc. The big thing to avoid with good file naming is spaces. So it's very easy to throw in an extra one on accident and then lose the file in the digital morass. But otherwise, it's up to you to find a naming system that works. You can use item titles, publishers, really any unique combination of bibliographic information and numbers. Then the easiest way to deal with metadata is simply to add an image file name column to the spreadsheet of your collection, and then type in the associated image file names for any items that you've digitized. You can, of course, create a separate spreadsheet if you want to do page level metadata, but we're not going to go that deep here unless someone has a burning question in the Q&A. And finally, I just want to touch very briefly on image storage. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the 3-2-1 rule, but it's one of the kind of golden rules of digital preservation. So the idea is that you keep 3 copies of your data in 2 different locations with at least one stored offsite or on physical media. Now, the thing about standards and golden rules is that they aren't always so practical in practice. So while we might stick to the 3-2-1 rule at work, I will let you all know a secret, which is that I do not always practice this with my personal data. But even if we kind of gesture at this, it's still helpful because really what the 3-2-1 rule teaches us is that it's important to have backups of your data. And if you're like me, just snapping iPhone pics of Jello booklets for reference at the thrift store, you might not need to go full hog on these rules. But certainly, if you go through the trouble of high resolution scans and color correction, you may want to consider having your files stored on an external hard drive, in the cloud, and on your personal computer. All right, so we've covered the various parts of the grant. So now I want to delve a bit into how we preserve our collections in the EKRLA and how you can use our methods at home. So we, like many smaller institutions, do not have a conservator on staff, meaning it's really up to me to deal with preservation issues that arise. This can be anything from old acidic paper that grows brittle over time and begins to chip, meaning small pieces kind of flake off at the edges, to paper clips that have rusted from their clipped papers. And I want to note that professional conservators also obviously do like way more than this. I'm just preserving stasis, while there are some amazing conservators who do more restoration work on items like repairing bindings or mending paper. Highly recommend a YouTube deep dive into book conservation. So when we look at our archive, we have some big no's that translate also into personal collecting. So first, no staples. I'm going to go into the ins and outs of staple removal a bit later on. But now I just want to say that, you might think the staple's not rusting. What's the problem? But beyond rust, staples also harm items because of the bending of the paper over time. So it doesn't matter how robust something seems after 100 years of being stapled and folded in the corner in the same place over and over, that corner will fall off. But for rust reasons, we don't use metal paper clips on our items. We don't put Post-it notes on. That lifts the ink off the page very often. It can also cause tears and other physical damage when being removed, especially when they've been on the item for a long time. We don't allow food and drink near collection items. This is both for the physical damage that spills can cause, but also for the possibility of crumbs, which attract all kinds of critters that like to eat books or mulch paper for their nests. We only use pencils in the archive, which is for that 1 in 1,000 time when your ballpoint explodes all over your hand and you don't notice, and suddenly you've smeared ink all over a 16th century herbal or Shakespeare's First Folio or whatever. Yes, we have a 16th century herbal in the collection. No, we do not have a First Folio. And last but not least on this list is often the big shocker to non kind of library folks. So we do not use gloves in the archive. And this is in fact archival standard. This is not me just playing fast and loose with the collection. Though the popular understanding of handling rare books in archives involves white gloves, this is actually a Hollywood fiction. Gloves actually increase the likelihood of damaging paper items. White gloves in particular are problematic because the small fibers in the cotton can snag on page edges and rip them. Gloves also lower the haptic feedback that you get. Your fingertips are incredibly sensitive, and they give you a lot of feedback about when a page is about to tear or if there's a weak spot. By wearing gloves, you numb these sensations, making it actually more likely that you will damage the item in question. There are, of course, a few exceptions to the no gloves rule. These include special binding materials such as metal or parchment, or for photographic materials, as the oils on our finger can damage these items. When we do use gloves, we eschew the white gloves in favor of nitrile. And I think having lived through COVID-19, we're all a bit more familiar with these. So I'm just going to run through these quickly. So, acid-free is very important when we're preserving paper materials. In the EKRLA, we use archival grade folders and boxes. In my personal collecting, I use archival grade acid-free sheet protectors. And you can see my storage over here on the right. It's also important, like the staples, to remember that folds become weak points over time. So it's always best to store items flat when possible. I say when possible because it really isn't always. I personally have a gigantic 1940s movie poster that I just do not have room for to store flat, so I do have to store it folded. And then finally, when we store items that are bound, so even staple bound, like many of my booklets, we always want to make sure that we're storing them binding side down so that the spines are supported. This helps prevent accidental folds and the bowing over time that can occur if they're stored foredge down. And you should also think about your book spines, especially if you do any rare book collecting, which I'll touch on in just a moment. So this is to show you all some of the low-cost tools that you can use for at-home preservation. On the left, you have a micro spatula, which are actually technically used in chemistry. So you can get these online for like less than $10. And these are incredibly handy for removing staples, as I will demonstrate in just a few slides. Next, we have a vulcanized rubber dirt eraser. It's not only incredibly useful, but also very fun to use. It's essentially like a dirt sponge. So if you have items that are particularly grimy, you can just gently dry sponge them off with a piece of this. I like to chop mine up, as you can see here, and it will lift the dirt and grime right off. Next, not to specifically kind of shill for Avery, though if they want to sponsor me, that would be great. But these are the sheet protectors that I personally use for my collection items. They're not so cheap. They run about $22 for 200, but they are acid-free, heavyweight, and archival grade. So I know that they will keep my collection safe. And then finally, if we say no staples and no metal paper clips, then how do we keep our materials together? And the answer is that we use plastic clips, which are also very easily accessible online. These minimize damage, they don't rust, and they can be easily removed to consult multi-page items. So as I mentioned earlier, if you're consulting rare or older books at all, you should really be using a book cradle or book pillow to support the spine and prevent damage to the binding. And these can also be just really helpful if you're trying to take notes from a book, regardless of age. But the thing is that these run really expensive online, like $85 for a pillow. So I have here two low-cost options for DIY book supports. I take no credit for the ingenious book supports here on the left. This is from the MIT libraries. And Tyvek is often used to make book pillows, but it's also used to make envelopes. So they came up with this book pillow that uses those like air-filled packing pillows that you might get in an online order inside a Tyvek envelope to create a custom support. If you'd like more information to see a kind of step-by-step guide, you can just Google MIT Book Cradle and their blog post should be the first result. Now, the more expensive and labor-intensive version, especially if you hand sew it, as I did, is to sew your own book pillow using scrap fabric and beanbag filler. But the nice thing about having a beanbag style book cradle is that it's just a bit more adjustable. So you can kind of move the beans depending on what kind of support you need, what the binding is looking like, etc. And finally, we're getting down to the end here. To round out the preservation section, I'm going to do two brief tutorials on the safe removal of paper clips and staples. So here we have a classic bad paperclip situation. You can see that it's rusting and causing damage to our item. So to safely remove, we just gently slip index cards under the paperclip on both sides. This buffers the item from damage as we remove the paperclip. We make sure that the cards go all the way up to the top of the paperclip, and then we just slide the paperclip off and onto the two cards. Finally, we swap it out for a plastic clip, ensuring that our prohibition document will last another 100 years. For safe staple removal, we remember again that although the staple isn't rusting, use over time would mean that we would lose that top left corner. So we get out our trusty micro spatula and gently insert it under each prong of the staple in turn. Holding the paper steady with our other hand so that we don't cause any tears, we gently pry up each side, then carefully remove the staple from the front. Finally, we swap it out for another plastic clip, and our article on the early history of the National Wholesale Druggists Association can breathe easy. And as a note, we use the microspatula rather than a traditional staple remover because it has a much lower incidence of tearing the item, especially with old and brittle materials. So we're at our last slide here, which is finding a forever home for your collection. So the final piece of collecting is what to do with your collection when you've reached the end of your collecting days, be it for storage reasons, cost, your partner finally puts their foot down, whatever it may be. And the obvious question is, where should it go? So we have a great repository here if you're looking to donate materials related to the history of pharmacy. But of course, we do have limited space, limited staff, and can't necessarily accept everything. But for us, we can always assist with alternatives should we not be able to take a collection. So for example, I'm a member of LAMPS, Librarians, Archivists, and Museum Professionals in the History of Health Sciences, and they maintain a listserv on which lots of institutions will connect potential donors with more suitable homes. You can also look more broadly. Your public library may have a local history collection and be interested in the materials, or your local historical society. You might contact your alma mater. If you have a specialized collection outside the realm of pharmacy history, you might find an institution with collecting strengths in that area. Once you've identified the institution you'd like to donate to, the next step is figuring out who your point of contact should be. So, though most institutions are very forgiving and emails will generally find their way to the right person, there is always that fear of an email getting kind of lost in the morass. So, the best path is to do some digging on the library archive or museum website. See if there's, an accessioning librarian, a donations coordinator, development coordinator, and then reach out to them. If there's no one so specialized, then reaching out to the director of a library or archive, or to a curator who deals in your specialization. You'll note that I said email, and that is not the stereotypical millennial fear of the phone, but rather a practicality. So your donation email is like a dating profile. You want to make it attractive to the institution without overwhelming them. Sending an email rather than calling means you can include information about the items and, most importantly, representative photographs. This gives a visual aid to the curator, which means that we spend less time figuring out whether it's an appropriate fit for our collection, while also containing all the information needed to pass along to administrators who might be making the final decisions about whether to move forward. You do not, however, necessarily want to send a full catalog and images of every item in that first email. So if we think again of the dating profile, we don't want to be too full on here. They don't need to know your whole full life story before you've even agreed to a first date, just enough to pique their interest and give a representative sample of your collection. So to me, the least fun part of donations is the money issue. As a collector myself, I know it's easy to think, my collection is amazing and anyone would be so lucky as to acquire it. But the reality is that pretty much anywhere you're donating your collection to is going to be a nonprofit. And I don't think I need to say that nonprofits are not exactly flush with extra cash to take on the costs associated with a donation. There's the shipping of the items if the donor is remote, the staff costs for accessioning, for processing or cataloging, the cost of rehousing the items, etc. And this is why many institutions have a policy of not accepting donations without a cash donation alongside. This isn't a policy here at the EKRLA, but we do still have to think critically about whether we can accept large donations. Do we have the staff time to deal with them properly? Because what no one wants, neither donors nor institutions, is to have donations come in and just languish, unaccessioned, uncatalogued, and inaccessible to researchers. That doesn't serve anyone. And some of this goes back to the cataloging of your collection. So it's going to be much more appealing for an institution to accept a collection that is thoroughly documented rather than just a big old box of stuff, because thorough documentation means less staff time spent accessioning. So obviously, one thing you can do when considering a donation is consider whether you would be able to donate money earmarked for processing the collection alongside the materials themselves. If not, can you cover the shipping costs? If neither of these are possible, you may be looking more at institutions nearby where you wouldn't need to necessarily cover those costs. But now you've listened to all of this and you're thinking, great, I have a wonderful history of pharmacy collection that is well documented and I want to donate it to the EKRLA. What now? So for information about donation, you can follow this QR code here. You can also contact us by email with any questions. And in the next slide, I'll have all of our contact information. And with that, we've come to the end of my seminar. I hope that you all are now even more excited about the history of community pharmacy and that you are coming away with a better understanding of collections management, both institutionally and personally. As you see here, there are a lot of ways to connect with the EKRLA. You can follow us on social media. And if you have any questions or comments or would like to visit AIHP to do research from any of the collections I highlighted today, feel free to reach out to the team at research@aihp.org.